This out. Now I can tell you I know why Harry wants a very physical presence by any member of the royal family, preferably Pa, King Charles, at the Invictus Games Foundation in 2027, but he's aiming to get a picture with the king right now.
What if the charity Prince Harry built as his ultimate symbol of compassion is now turning into the legal and financial nightmare he desperately needs King Charles III to help conceal? Because behind the medals, emotional speeches, wounded veterans, and polished Invictus image, a storm is allegedly gathering involving a $2.4 million lawsuit, devastating injuries, disputed financial records, taxpayer money, and questions that could become impossible to silence before the Birmingham Games in 2027. Suddenly, that heavily discussed desire for King Charles III to stand beside Harry looks very different. Is this truly about a father and son finally presenting a united front again? Or is Harry desperately hunting for the one thing money, publicity, and royal connections can no longer manufacture? A shield? For years, the Invictus Games seemed almost untouchable. Criticize the royal family. Criticize Harry's lifestyle. Criticize the Sussex brand if you like, but criticizing wounded service personnel was another matter entirely. Invictus was supposed to be sacred ground. It was built on sacrifice, rehabilitation, courage, and the extraordinary determination of veterans who had already survived unimaginable battles. That was the magic. That was the protection surrounding the brand. But then came the allegations involving Scott Snow. In September 2023, inside the Merkerspiel Arena in Dusseldorf, Germany, a 14-year veteran of the Royal Canadian Navy was competing in wheelchair rugby at the very event meant to represent hope for injured military personnel. Scott Snow was not there seeking celebrity attention. He was there as a veteran trying to rebuild his life through sport. Yet, according to allegations described in court proceedings, something went terribly wrong during the match. The competition wheelchair allegedly lacked proper restraint straps designed to secure the athlete during violent collisions. Then came the impact. Scott Snow lunged for the ball. The wheelchair tipped backward. His body was thrown upside down, and his head, neck, and upper spine slammed onto the arena floor. And this is where the story gets even darker, because the controversy isn't simply about what happened during those few seconds on the court. It's about what allegedly happened afterward. According to the allegations, instead of receiving the immediate emergency response expected after a potentially catastrophic spinal injury, Scott Snow was reportedly given only a cursory examination, with no dramatic emergency evacuation. No immediate specialized trauma intervention. No comprehensive neurological assessment of the kind you might expect after such a devastating impact. He was eventually sent home to Canada, and then the nightmare continued. Pain became disability. Numbness became neurological deterioration. His injuries allegedly progressed until he became quadriplegic, requiring permanent assistance and around-the-clock care. A man who had spent 14 years serving his country was suddenly facing a completely transformed existence. Now comes the question making this controversy so explosive. When Scott Snow and his family sought accountability and financial support, who ultimately became the target of the $2.4 million legal battle? Not the Invictus Games Foundation directly. The lawsuit was brought against the Canadian federal government and the Department of National Defense, shifting the financial fight toward public institutions and ultimately taxpayers. And according to the narrative surrounding the case, one reason this became so complicated was a liability waiver connected to participation in the games. Think about that contradiction. An organization celebrated for supporting wounded veterans can simultaneously require participants to accept legal conditions, limiting their ability to pursue claims. If something goes catastrophically wrong, where does responsibility actually land? On the event, the local organizing entity, the government, the medical personnel, or the athlete who signed the paperwork? That's where the glossy Invictus story begins colliding with a far uglier legal reality. And suddenly, the heroic image starts looking less untouchable and much more vulnerable to questions nobody wants answered. And the controversy doesn't end with one injured veteran. The next layer digs into the corporate machinery behind the games themselves. What looks on television like one giant global organization is actually linked to separate legal and organizing entities across countries and host cities, including Germany, Canada, Britain, and now Birmingham. That fragmentation raises an explosive question. When an international event goes wrong, who actually carries the liability? The answer could reveal just how exposed the central Invictus organization really is. And that is exactly why the financial records suddenly matter so much. Because if the legal questions crack open the door, the accounting questions could practically blow it off its hinges. Reports involving Invictus organizing committees in Canada and Germany have faced intense scrutiny, with allegations that publicly released financial documents contain extensive redactions. The public sees blacked-out pages. The public sees missing details. And naturally, one question becomes impossible to avoid. What exactly is hiding behind those black lines? Travel, accommodation, security, executive expenses, or something else entirely? The bigger question is why taxpayers should accept darkness when public money is involved. If millions are being committed to events supposedly serving wounded veterans, people naturally want to know where every major dollar is going. And looming over everything is Birmingham 2027. The British government has reportedly committed a £26.6 million financial underwrite. That number sounds like confidence. It sounds like institutional backing. But an underwrite isn't simply applause. It's a financial safety net, available if other sources fail to cover the costs. Suddenly, Harry's dream of a triumphant Invictus return to Britain becomes far more complicated. Because if private funding falls short, who carries the risk? The taxpayer. And if the legal storm surrounding Scott Snow grows larger, financial questions become louder, and courts demand records organizations would rather keep private, then Birmingham could become more than a sporting celebration. It could become the stage where uncomfortable questions finally demand answers. And that's where the story gets even more explosive, because the financial questions surrounding Invictus allegedly stretch well beyond the courtroom. The original narrative points toward a maze of separate entities, local organizing committees, government support, and financial records that critics say deserve much closer scrutiny. The games began in 2014 as a deeply personal royal mission connected to military service and the rehabilitation of wounded personnel. But after Harry and Meghan left the royal family in 2020, the surrounding structure reportedly became increasingly international and fragmented, with different entities managing different host locations. Germany had its own organizing structure. Canada had another, while Birmingham was developing yet another framework for 2027. That arrangement may have legitimate administrative reasons, but critics are questioning whether fragmentation can also make accountability harder to trace when something goes wrong. Then there are the expenses. The original allegations describe enormous sums supposedly connected to travel, accommodation, security, public relations, and executive logistics surrounding Harry and Meghan at recent games. The most inflammatory claims involve private aircraft, luxury hotels, extensive security arrangements, personal staff, stylists, media teams, and other expenses allegedly tied to their appearance. If the games cannot secure enough private funding, that public safety net remains essential. But if competent authorities ever establish serious financial misconduct, funding arrangements could face political and legal scrutiny. That still would not automatically mean bankruptcy, frozen funding, or collapse. It does, however, explain why transparency suddenly matters so much. And this is where Harry's royal connection becomes impossible to overlook. The man who once launched Invictus alongside the royal institution is now operating outside the protective structure that originally gave the project its authority. His biggest humanitarian achievement was built when royal duty, military service, and institutional credibility were tightly connected to his public identity. Now, years later, that same project is confronting lawsuits, financial questions, and an increasingly loud debate over accountability. So why would Harry want King Charles III beside him in Birmingham? Simple.